That being said, maybe I'll invite Roy to give our spiritual opening, and then I'll begin with the introductions.
Go ahead, Suzanne. Okay, I'm just going to light up some sage here. Just give me a second. Okay, so before we can just take a moment or two to gather your thoughts and prayers, and we'll invite Spirit in. So I'd like to say miigwech to Mother Earth for providing the 4 sacred medicines that take care of us spiritually, emotionally, physically, and mentally. And miigwech to our ancestors for guiding us in a good way. I'd also like to acknowledge for directions and acknowledge the beings and animals on the earth, including the 2-legged, 4-legged flyers and the swimmers. And we look forward to today's presentation. Miigwech, miigwech, miigwech.
Thank you, Roy Miigwech, for that beautiful opening. My name is Suzanne Stewart, and I am the nominated principal applicant for the Ontario Network for Environment and Indigenous Health. I'm from the Yellowknife Dene First Nation, and I live and work here in Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory as a professor of public health at the Dalalana School of Public Health in the Waakebiness Institute for Indigenous Health. And I'm very excited to be here today to introduce our speakers this month from one of the community partners of the NEIHR, and that is the Congress of Aboriginal People. So I'm going to invite our presenters today, who are Nazih, Lydia, and Darienne, who are working with the Ontario NEIHR on some research to do with Indigenous mental health and homelessness. So Nazih, would you like to start?
Miigwech, Suzanne, Moderator Miigwech, Roy, for the beautiful prayers earlier. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm very happy to be here to have this conversation with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. So I guess I would like to start by acknowledging that we are gathering on the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, Wendat, Hearn, and Haudenosaunee peoples on which the Dalalana School of Public Health now stands. The territory was subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We would like to also pay our respects to all our ancestors and to our present elders. Also, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, CAP, respectfully acknowledges the location of its national head office in Ottawa, and this traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, and respectfully acknowledges all other unceded traditional territories of its provincial and territories constituents. My name is Nazih Nasrallah. I'm the Director of Research, CAP. I've been with CAP for over 3 years. I'm an applied sociologist by training. I'm actually of non-European descent. I was born in Lebanon, and I emigrated to Canada about 33 years ago. Very happy to be here, and I would like to maybe pass it over to Lydia to also introduce herself, please.
Everyone, I'm happy to be here. My name is Lydia, and I'm of mixed settler heritage, and I'm calling in today from Dish with One Spoon Treaty Territory I'm a research analyst at the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, and I support the development of housing research, including a project on homelessness as it impacts populations living off reserve. I'm also a research assistant at the Waakebiness Institute for Indigenous Health, working on a project that looks at traumatic brain and spinal cord injuries. And I'm also in my second year of the Master of Public Health program in Indigenous Health, the University of Toronto. So I will throw it to Darienne.
Thank you, Lydia. Hello, everyone. My name is Darienne Russell. I'm a graduate student at the University of Toronto, as well as a research assistant at the Waakebiness Institute of Indigenous Health. I'm originally from Northern BC, and I'm a member of Claxton Nation. I'm very grateful to be able to live, work, and play on the traditional and unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I've spent some time working in housing and homelessness in Vancouver, BC, and I've seen firsthand many of the barriers within policy surrounding the transition from being homeless to housed. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I'm very excited to share our work with you.
Thank you, Lydia and Darienne. If you don't mind, Lydia, maybe put on the slides, please. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so today we'll be sharing with you some of the research that CAP is doing, community-based research that serves our constituents and communities. So we'll be talking about, yeah, thank you, Lydia. We'll be sharing with you some of the overall research that CAP is doing in various priority areas, but we'll be also focusing a little bit on the housing research and, you know, taking a deeper dive at the homelessness research that currently conducted partnership with the Waakebiness Institute. So to start off, I'd like to talk a little bit about who we are. So the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples is one of the 5 national indigenous organizations, otherwise known as NIOs. The other, you know, 4 being the AFN, the ITK, MNC, and WAC. It's one of the 5 NIOs recognized by the federal government, and was established in 1971. It used to be called the NCC, where it really focused on representing the interest of the non-status Indians, Metis, and mixed blood peoples. Only until 1993, that's when CAP, you know, started focusing really on the off-reserve. So that includes, of course, status, non-status, First Nations, Métis, but also Southern Inuit, Indigenous peoples outside the Inuit Nunavut. And we work closely with our constituents to improve and enhance the collective well-being. So to describe a little bit more on that landscape or demographics of who our communities are, if you wish, who we advocate for. As you know, the total indigenous population is about 5%. That's as per, you know, the recent census 2021 data that came out. So the off-reserve, indigenous off-reserve population is about 82% of that population. And the non-status, you know, non-registered treaty Indians, they're over 50%, so about 54% of the indigenous peoples in this country, they are actually non-status. And again, this is all based on the recent census data. So if you look at the First Nations, for example, about 28% are actually non-status. The Métis population, vast majority are non-status. And these numbers increased from 2016. So if you look at the changes, you see there's more non-status. The non-status population increase, so is the off-reserve by about 3 to 5% respectively. And if you look at the Métis population itself, in particular, about 73% of that population are not one of the 5 signatory of the Canada Métis Nation Accord, nor living in Alberta Métis settlements. So, yeah, so everything else basically are the constituents or the communities that CAP are voice for, or strives to serve and be voice for. Same thing for the Inuit population. We have about 30% they live outside or south of the Inuit Nunagat, including our constituents in Labrador, Nunatuqavut. Okay. So that's yeah, that's who we are and who these are our communities or potential communities and constituents. Now, CAP, if you talk about the Congress of Aboriginal People, we must talk about Daniel's decision. Of course, Harry Daniel was the ex-national chief of CAP, and he served as a national chief for actually a few times. Passed away about 20 years ago in Regina. So he was spearheading, this very long legal battle with the government. Finally, the Supreme Court, we got this decision, known Daniel's decision, where the government finally declared that they have this fiduciary obligation towards particularly the non-status and Métis, basically consider them as North American Indians as per the charter. So that was really a very important turning point for CAP. And since then, so a few years after, to be specific, in 2018, end of 2018, that's when CAP actually signed the political accord, okay, which resulted really, or was a spin-off, if you like, of the decision, Daniel's decision. That was very important because that's when CAP started negotiating with the government about how to strengthen and how to, programs, policies, and how to work with the government to ensure that our constituents' needs are met across many priority areas. Next slide, please, Lydia. Right. Yeah, and because of so with the political accord, there was the political accord implementation, which meant that the CAP currently formed 6 Government for Canada CAP working groups, if you like. They call priority working groups. So the focus was on 6 areas: housing, family, child welfare, post-secondary education, the missing and murdered, languages, and justice. Of course, there are other priority areas that CAP continues to advocate for and work with our constituency on, including climate change, health, of course, that's a big one. Also international relations, domestic violence, etc., etc. Next slide, please. So these are our affiliates organizations. So when I mentioned that CAP has community representation, CAP has basically 11 PTOs, provincial territorial organizations, coast to coast, and these are basically, they make up the board. So CAP has a board of directors that made up of the chiefs, PTO chiefs and presidents that make up the board of directors, and these are the liaison to the community, and they are the ones that they really drive our research and policies, right? So the PTOs are actually more involved with the local level, so providing, various services and advocacy from ground up, if you like, while CAP, the headquarters, advocates at the national level, and always based or directed by the PTOs and / communities needs. And these tables that I mentioned, the Government of Canada, CAP, priority tables, the 6 tables that currently running as a result of this implementation of the political accord, they are represented. We have PTO representation, all of them. So these tables, they have representatives from the Government of Canada, it depends on the priority area, and also have corresponding CAP representative from the national team, and also, of course, from the PTOs. So a little bit about our research. So, CAP basically, when it comes to our research mandate, initially CAP was known really to be an advocacy organization, and of recent we became really more focused on having a more clear and defined research and policy mandates. So in my team, the research mandate, we really provide information support across the board. And I say across the board, that means everybody within CAP. We have different teams in CAP, from partnerships to policy to the ISIT program, which is the Indigenous Skills and Employment Program. It's, by the way, one of the very few service delivery programs that we run at the national level. So the research team provide, all the support, qualitative, quantitative information, etc., across the board, and we support all those priority areas. So we're sort of expert in all these areas, or trying to be, doing our best to always provide evidence-based information that will continue to support CAP's ongoing advocacy works, right? And policy works as well. Currently, we're also trying to put together a research and data strategy for CAP, which is important document to really direct the research. So we'll be developing things like research ethics, decolonizing data, research methodologies, the Indigenous data sovereignty, evaluation strategies, accountability measures, etc., etc. These will be, major components, and that will further support the research that is conducted currently at CAP, or will be conducted in the near future. When we do research, we do our best to deploy a 2-eyed seeing approach methodology, which mixes, Western methodology with also the Indigenous, of course, the methodologies and conceptualizations. I'll be talking a little bit about this when, sort of case in point, when I zoom in a little about housing research. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. So yeah, so that's that's the quick description of the type of research that we do at CAP, and kind of methodologies and etc., and the priority areas that we support. Now, in terms of the concrete examples, so the currently, I would like now to switch gears a little bit and talk about perhaps some of the housing maybe research that we are currently doing at CAP. So CAP has already put together a comprehensive data-driven literature review that looked at all the challenges and gaps faced by the off-reserve Indigenous peoples, our constituents. And that was actually first comprehensive correlation study that looks specifically at the impact of housing conditions. The impact of housing conditions on 4 particular outcomes. We looked at health, we looked at education, labor market, and language, which responded to CAP's AGA resolution back in 2018 that basically asked CAP to collect and analyze data on the off-reserve housing. And of course, it's in line with the political accord that was signed in 2018, December 2018, that I talked about earlier, which stipulates various priority areas that I also mentioned something about via these tables. Phase 2 was if you wish, the data analysis stage of phase 1. So we sort of trying to corroborate and test all those correlations that we hypothesized about in the literature review. And so was a lot of number crunching there. And there was a couple of sections we looked at. We did trend analysis data, and also did some more analytical work looking at both bivariant and multivariate analysis. I just want to actually mention something. In every report that CAP produces, the kind of research we do is always policy driven, policy oriented type of research. So in every report that CAP produces, we always have top of the executive summaries and fact sheets, etc. We also have recommendations moving forward. So these are more practical recommendations for CAP and for our communities to improve, right? Improve and address the gaps in policies and programming and service deliveries to have better outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes for our constituents. So that's standard in all our reports. Phase 3 is something that we are currently conducting. It's really interesting. It's a costing study. So in short, we'll be telling the government, after we identified all those gaps, right? And we showed the evidence that they exist, and we show how important it is to address them. We actually currently trying to do something called costing studies. We'll be telling the government how much would it cost the government to actually narrow those gaps by a certain percentage, right? Let's say if we want to narrow this gap by 30%, how much it's going to cost the government via interventions, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really it's current. The sources for the data source for this research is actually twofold. Census 2021, which just came out, as you know, the Indigenous data, the census data just came out just a few months ago. However, as you can imagine, many of the data that available by the government doesn't really cut it for us. It doesn't really meet, many times doesn't meet both the counts and the needs of our constituents. So that's why we tend to do our own primary data collection analysis. In this particular example, we actually designed and currently in the process of collecting data related to housing. In particular, we were looking at the type of repairs that required to in households, which is data not captured by the census. Okay, so we had the chance to actually promote this data recently with we just had a housing symposium in Vancouver. So there was an engagement session with our PTOs, and we had the chance to also promote this survey there. So that's part 1 of the phase. So phase 3 is actually 2 years project that we are currently developing. Part 2 is looking actually at the market policies. So that's something coming as well. So Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is more about this survey. So we actually encourage everybody to complete it. It's in circulation. We just tell you something a little bit more about it. And this is actually sort of inspired also by some of the techniques used by Dr. Janet Smiley, etc. Focuses on response driven sampling. So what we did is we're looking for about 2,200 people to complete this survey. That's the sample we're looking for that will give it enough descriptive and predictive power, if you like, in line with the other data that we're using, the census data that I mentioned. So we are really trying to promote the survey now, and your participation actually in this survey will be appreciated very much. Okay, so moving along. So partners, I mean, because of the, this wide spectrum of research that we are currently undertaking or planning to undertake, you can imagine that we deals with various research partners, whether it's government or indigenous communities, indigenous consultants, and also, of course, the academics and the universities. And I would like to highlight, of course, our recent partnership with the Waakebiness Institute for Indigenous Health, where we're currently conducting an amazing research that looks at homelessness and mental health. And we're doing scoping review, and we'll be doing meta-analysis. If all goes well, we'll be also working with the tri-councils after that. So speaking of which, I think that probably be a good segue to now focus more on this research. And maybe I'll pass it on to both Lydia and Darienne at this point. Which?
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, my microphone sometimes is really weird. I'm just going to talk a little bit about our partnership with Waakebiness. So in 2022, we partnered with Waakebiness Institute for Indigenous Health to engage in a research project that looks at the systemic barriers within policies that impact the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional health and well-being of Indigenous peoples living off reserve and facing homelessness or precarious housing. So we're currently working on a scoping review. So some of the project objectives of the scoping review is to look at within the current literature, what are the current systemic barriers and policies that directly impact the health and well-being for status, non-status First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples that are living off reserve and facing precarious housing or homelessness. And also looking at to what extent does literature focus on the topics of homelessness and mental health, and how does it address Indigenous identity and geographic location? And also to look at the kinds of research that's being carried out for and with Indigenous populations. I'll pass this to Darienne to share a little bit about our methods and results.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't realize my microphone was off. For this review, we utilized the 5-stage scoping review protocol that was outlined by ARCSI and O'Malley. So step 1 consisted of specifying the research question. Step 2 was identifying relevant research. Step 3 was selecting the studies. Step 4 is extracting, charting, and mapping out the data. And step 5 was summarizing, synthesizing, and reporting the data. So as a research team, the 3 of us independently reviewed the title, abstracts, and full texts of each selected paper, and we included them or excluded them based on our inclusion criteria that we prepared before we started data extraction. Any conflicts that arose were talked through as a group and came to a consensus collectively whether or not we would include or exclude them within the review. Our inclusion criteria was quite broad in order to capture the full extent of the research on Indigenous homelessness. So we were really focused on including any and all data from First Nations, Inuit, and Metis people in studies that were published between 2000 and 2022. So at the end of our process, we ended up finding 35 studies that were relevant to the scope of our review. They included qualitative, quantitative, as well as mixed method data. We noticed there was a heavy emphasis on Indigenous homelessness in urban centers in particular, reporting from Canada's major cities across a variety of provinces and territories. If you look at the map on this slide, you can see the number breakdown. One of the emergent gaps we noticed was the lack of data that focuses on rural homelessness, which we suspect is due to issues such as hidden homelessness. We also found limited information regarding Indigenous identity. Many of the articles we found came from a very pan-Indigenous approach, meaning it was not specified whether the population was First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. They were instead referred to collectively as Indigenous. And in addition to that, we also found there was minimal information about the first-hand homelessness experience for status, non-status First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So this slide shows the breakdown of the number of studies produced by year that we included in our review. As you can see, the highest number of papers were published in 2015. We suspect that this may be due to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission being published that year. During the process of reviewing the articles, we did decide to exclude papers from 2000 to 2004 due to a lack of specific context or quality of inclusion of Indigenous people in the research. This decision was in line with trying to indigenize our approach to this review. We really wanted to focus on highlighting community engagement within the research. And we found that the papers published after 2004 did a better job of this. We also noticed it wasn't until more recently that the homeless counts began to include Indigenous identity through a qualitative research approach. So we're just starting to get more accurate information on the experiences of urban homelessness in specific Indigenous groups.
So I think now I'll talk a little bit about the policies and what we found in the research in terms of the policies that are impacting the health and well-being for Indigenous populations. So I just want to note that in terms of historical policies, they're not just historical, like these are living documents that have continual impacts. So some of these policies that have impacted Indigenous homelessness and, contributed to the housing crisis, can be rooted in the 1763 Royal Proclamation. This policy was created and sustained the idea that Indigenous peoples are wards of the government. So this is where that continued idea of guardianship can be traced. Losing Indigenous status was considered an honor. Indian agents became responsible for housing in the transition to European modeled homes. And, we still see the continual impact of this. You have the British North America Act. Provinces were inoculated from having to politically respond to Indigenous peoples. And this was really the foundation to the housing crisis. It was that legal and policy separation from, the mainstream settler colonial society. You have the Indian Act, which is a racist heteronormative piece of legislation, which, tried to take away Indigenous people's rights to self-determination and sovereignty. There's other policies like the 1938 Housing Act, which restricted policy development in how provinces were able to interpret that British North America Act. You have the residential school system, which continues to have those intergenerational and mental health impacts for community. Other policies that are impacting Indigenous health and well-being in terms of housing and homelessness include income and support policy and practices. So, policies that reduce child tax benefit from women on social assistance, keeps them and their families in poverty. EI, employment insurance, is unavailable for women who have only had part-time jobs or temporary jobs. A reduction in tax credits and benefits results in, overcrowding and taking places that, are not safe or affordable for families. Municipal government policy plays a big role, in sustaining these systemic barriers. Urban renewal projects displace people without putting in replacement for housing alternatives. And federal housing policy supports that by, excluding and not funding municipal governments the way they need to be funded so that resources can be provided to, respond and assist Indigenous social housing needs. Landlord and tenant policies and regulations. Those on social assistance are discriminated against and forced into accepting places that, are unhealthy or unsafe or crowded. And it goes beyond social assistance. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples very generally face a lot of discrimination within the housing market. You see provincial policies that allow for rental hikes for places built after 2018, in which is giving developers and landlords, of these new developments, the autonomy to control the markets, not, having a care for those who are living within them. Policies for people with disabilities. Disability income assistance is not enough to support the daily living needs. Governments are really misinformed and they don't respond to these in the way that they should be to support community. There's a lack of support for educational opportunities, childcare opportunities, transportation, training, and overall really funding for existing programs, especially for communities that are doing really good work. There's also minimum wage. Minimum wage is not a livable wage. It's not sufficient in meeting families' basic needs. Children's services and the policies within that also play a huge role in, the advancement or the increase in homelessness. You have Bill S-210, the Children and Family Services Act. It requires, service workers to inquire about Indian status. Although we have Indigenous family and child services, they're still required to act and, practice within these policies, these Western created policies. Children's services itself, there's discriminatory treatment against Indigenous peoples by removing children from the home. There's a lack of protection for tenants, making it easy to discriminate against families, especially for those who are on social assistance and forced to accept places that are unhealthy and are unsafe. And then lastly, there's shelter policies. Shelters aren't always a safe place, especially for women and gender diverse peoples. Sometimes there's substandard living conditions. There's other policies like, 2-week stay policies, which are directly placing people back into homelessness.
So through this review, we noticed that many of the papers reported on the inadequate support in urban cities, as well as increased discrimination in the labor and housing market. This is largely due to the ongoing colonial impacts that continue to affect Indigenous people, like Lydia was talking about, which makes it more difficult for them to be accepted into long-term housing and obtain long-term employment. We also noticed there's inconsistencies within large-scale enumeration, but we did see that what remains consistent is that Indigenous people face homelessness at a much higher rate than non-Indigenous people. We also noticed there's barriers for communities that have been discriminated against due to Indigenous status, like Lydia had said. This includes things like landlords not wanting to rent to them, which results in not having the opportunity to participate in the housing market equally. Many of the papers also emphasize the need for consistency within funding to community organizations to provide these resources. And a lot of the papers also had talked about the mental, physical, and spiritual health impacts that homelessness have on Indigenous people. Some of them noted things like nutrition, level of exhaustion, anxiety and depression, loss of security and belonging, as well as higher violence within shelters and on the streets. And lastly, like Lydia had mentioned previously, we noticed that women and two-spirited people are more likely to experience hidden homelessness and feel less safe in emergency shelters. Much of the literature reported on transphobia and violence within these systems, mixed with a lack of support and resources. And lastly, much of the focus for shelters is for women who are homeless due to violence. So it can make it extremely difficult for women who are facing homelessness to access the resources that they need.
So I just want to share really quickly about, kind of the strengths-based approach to this and what we found in the literature. So I think this is really about finding the strengths and those resiliency factors. So looking at the role of empathy and access to community and how that translates into decolonizing policy and practices. So in our review, we found that empathy and culturally rooted policies that are anti-oppressive and incorporate the diverse, Indigenous worldviews and perspectives is critical to advancing the well-being and sovereignty and self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Turtle Island, regardless of status, gender, age. In most of our studies, we found that when there's access to community, when there's access to funding, mental health support, and really just overall kinship, there's better health outcomes in all aspects of health. There's been some really great programs and research initiatives done in the urban centers. I just want to share one really quickly. There was a program run by the Blackfoot community in Lethbridge, Alberta, which brought together the homeless community there to participate in this program in a really good way. It gave the opportunity for participation in ceremony, the sharing of food and friendship. It also provided, people who are homeless with the opportunity to go on day trips together. And people in this program felt that, when they're in these spaces and had access to culture and cultural connections, warmth and food, there was less thought about the realities of homelessness and substance use and, all of the things that come with that. So it just shows that, access to community and belonging plays a major role in how others can heal in this life journey. This program drew social service workers to come to the community and understand people where they're at, and for them to also participate in this process in a good way. And the outcome of that was, people were able to have a more empathetic and trauma-informed approach, where they were able to get access to services and housing, long-term housing, mind you, in the way that they needed. And that was great. And I think it just shows, it's a good example of how, policies and practices within government at all levels, can make adjustments and can make these changes to benefit community in a way that's culturally safe, trauma-informed, and also redefines all those power dynamics. We're almost out of time. So I just kind of want to conclude and just say, housing is a human right and a lack of it is a human right violation. Policies and practices need to be grounded in spirit. There needs to be an understanding of empathy systemically, and there needs to be self-determination and sovereignty in housing for Indigenous peoples. I lastly just wanted to say that, as Nazih mentioned before, CAP held a housing conference in Vancouver this month, and it brought together delegates from across Canada, across Turtle Island. And what we heard from our communities is that, reducing homelessness and housing barriers that currently exist requires action taken to ensure that, wages are livable and that policies are not discriminatory based on status. There's a major need to address the systemic barriers within the colonial legal justice system and the child welfare system that are direct contributors to homelessness for communities. Municipalities and landlords play a key role in sustaining housing inequities. And it's really important that we need to change those power dynamics, to include Indigenous peoples in leadership and policy. And this isn't new information, but, it needs to keep getting pushed and keep being advocated for. And overall, communities across Turtle Island need access to culturally safe programs, mental health supports, addiction services, and really access to community. And everyone at the conference was asked to just write down some words that resonated with them while we were discussing homelessness and housing. And, a big one was home, respect, honesty, revival. So I thought I would just share that with you all. So Miigwech, thank you so much. And if you would like to connect after this presentation, we would be happy to have a chat. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Lydia, Darienne, and Nazih, and thank you, Roy, for the opening. And please, I'd like to invite all of the audience members to type your questions in the Q&A if you have any. We don't have any yet, but I have a few questions for you. And I'd like to say, first of all, thank you for a very comprehensive and amazing presentation. You got a lot in there in a short period of time. And I guess one of the questions, because it's reading break, one of my daughters was sitting in here and watching this with me, and we were commenting on the information you were providing. And she actually had a great question, which I don't think I had thought of. And she said, you know, Mom, she was looking at your slides, all the information you were providing. She said, you know, Mom, it's the same stuff all the time about this is what the problem is with homelessness. When are people going to do something? And I guess maybe I'm going to translate that question to you guys is, what do you think, given that we do really know and understand what the significance of homelessness is and what the mediating factors are around that for Indigenous people, what are we going to do about it now from your perspectives?
Well, maybe I can start. So that's a very good question, by the way. So, you know, and I definitely relate to the March break as well, because, you know, somehow I made it this presentation. Of course, happy I did that. So, you know, this is a question that applies across the board, as you know, Suzanne, whether it's homelessness, it's housing, applies to the other priorities where we identify the gaps, right? And these gaps, it seems to be systematic. They seem to be, you know, caused by the usual suspects, you know, the systematic barriers, factors that we all know about. And what are we trying to do at CAP? Right? First of all, we try at least to make sure that, you know, we are on the table. Okay. Sometimes I say, if you're not on the table, you'll be on the menu. Okay. So it's important that we engage and try and when it comes to government, for example, that we try and make sure that these gaps are well identified and we present all the evidence, you know, evidence-based information, etc. And of course, we are also, while we're doing this, we try to be in touch with the community, our communities, our constituents as well, across from coast to coast, to make sure that we really understand these issues, and you know, and we make sure they are, you know, aligned, not just aligned, but they actually inform our advocacy works when it comes to engagement with, you know, with the government, for example. So on the research side of things, we're happy that we're doing this research in collaboration with the Institute. We're actually very happy we're doing this partnership, actually, period. I believe it's going to benefit CAP, it's going to benefit our constituents, it's going to go a long way. But, you know, I'm sure Lydia maybe and Darienne can maybe talk a little bit about the specific evidences that we found from so far from the reviews we've been doing, and how can we transcribe that into practical recommendations, policy, programming, service delivery wise, as we always try to do. Okay, so if you would like to add something, Lydia, please, and Darienne, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment. Like, you know, Indigenous community organizations are already doing, you know, such amazing work on the ground level for community, especially in terms of homelessness. And it's really unfortunate. It's like there needs to be follow through on the end of the government. You know, there needs to be consistency and core funding to all these organizations who are actually doing the groundwork. And the other thing too is, like, I was reading the Auditor General report on homelessness that came out in November, and they were saying that, like, we don't know how organizations and how homelessness is actually being reduced, because we don't understand how, like, these funds are being spent. And like CMHC puts billions of dollars into, you know, finding housing solutions for people, yet you see a rise in homelessness, and Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by it. So it's like, I just, you know, feel like there's so many people doing good work and like this continued advocacy and resistance of like this colonial agenda, but you know, it's getting the government to comply and like ensuring that there's funding and that there's opportunities for communities to, you know, do the work themselves.
Yeah, I echo what Lydia and Nazih are both saying. I think it's really important that the policies are reflecting the work that the community organizations are doing. But I think it's also important to realize that it goes beyond having a policy put into place. There needs to be very strong accountability measures to make sure that these things are being followed long term.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will relate that information to my daughter, who breezed out of the room shortly after asking that important question. We have another question in the chat, and it says, has the research looked at employment barriers facing Indigenous peoples and the current absence of any provincial, territorial, or municipal employment equity policies, especially as we await the Federal Employment Equity Act review report, and also recognize that the federal employment equity legislation only covers about 10 to 11% of the Canadian labor market?
I just maybe want to add, our scoping review hasn't looked like super in depth. It's still a work in progress. We're still learning and we're still finding information because there's so many policies, and like looking at how many policies there are and like how they impact community is like so much work. So we're trying, and that's a really good comment, and we're going to keep that in mind for like as we continue to write. Nazih, I don't know if there's anything on that within like the CMHC housing project. I'm not sure if you know, but
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, you know, the work that was done with the housing, the phase 1, phase 2, etc., really focused on housing, not homelessness. The scholars, they tend to be focusing on either or because of, you know, because of the magnificent, you know, space that these priority areas occupy in the literature. So the work that we did focused on the housing conditions as it relates to those priority areas. And we actually concluded very quickly that we require, you know, a more, like a separate research is warranted to look at specifically homelessness and policies and programming, okay? And hence is the work that we're currently trying to conduct with in collaboration with the Institute. So, but I'm sure, you know, the findings will, you know, will align with you know, the systematic barriers that we found. They also will be very interested to see how this changed over time and how does it also align with our constituent engagement. So
I can add a bit to that question as well. I don't recall seeing anything about employment barriers. It may have been outside the scope of this review, but I will note that a large theme that I did notice was when the literature was talking about policies, it often talked about in a very broad scope of there needs to be policy change, but it was never specific as to which ones or what areas.
Yeah, and I think that those are great responses, because this research really didn't include employment or education sort of transitions, and that is a good question. I can say from my own research, you know, outside of what we've been doing with CAP for about 13 years, from 2007 to 2020, most of my research on homelessness focused on educational and employment transitions and career development for Indigenous people, and I did publish quite a lot around that. So if anyone was interested, they could just search up, you know, the education and homelessness and my name, and the publications would come up. But I think just to answer the question in concrete terms from what our research showed around that is that yes, housing itself, like what we're looking at with CAP, is definitely a factor in not being stably housed, and that's growing because housing is getting to be more and more scarce as we go further into, like, from the pandemic and then into the big recession. Housing is just getting more out of reach for people and less accessible. But in addition to housing, employment and education are also huge mediating factors in not having stable housing, as well as mental health. And that's largely what our research showed, because a lot of the employment opportunities really don't respect Indigenous people and provide a lot of systemic barriers to employment, not only employment, but career development, which is kind of the more important piece. And that's where people, have an identity that's around what they're doing with their work life, rather than just going job to job. And the systemic barriers around racism and discrimination are really what are the main things around employment and career development for Indigenous people. So you can look into that research. I have a lot of stuff published about that, but we won't go too far into that. So I just like to thank our, oh, there's one more things in the chat, but let's see, we're at 2 minutes away. I guess we have time just to read one of them really quick. They were wondering about your thoughts on the role of the doctrine of discovery on homelessness, houselessness, which has had and continues to have major impact on Indigenous people and land. For example, it still provides legal justification for stealing land. It is still the foundation of Canadian law and continues to govern Indigenous lands, which has led to houselessness. Anyone want to respond to that?
No, I think, yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that's a really great point. Like, you can't separate this conversation without talking about the doctrine of discovery. It's critical to the foundation of these policies and like the continual impacts of policies and these early ideas that came up, and the stealing of Turtle Island, and displacing Indigenous peoples on their own lands. It's definitely something that we'll be discussing, I think, in our paper, and we didn't get to talk too much about it. I think we just talked a little bit more about some of the earlier policies. But thank you for your comment.
Thank you. So I'd just like to remind the audience members to please fill out our feedback survey. The link is in the chat. We greatly appreciate, and we really love to get your feedback on how to continually improve our webinars for everyone. And I'd like to thank Nazih from CAP and Lydia and Darienne, who are also working as research assistants at CAP and at Waakebiness. So Masi Cho, thank you to all of you. It's been a wonderful and informative session. And thank you to all the audience members for tuning in. We love to have you here, and we're very grateful that you take the time to be here and support this work. So please, thank you from the bottom of my heart. And Roy, thank you for our opening, and thank you in ahead of time for the closing that you're about to do for us.
Thank you, Suzanne. I just want to thank everybody for attending, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. We'd just like to ask Creator to keep us and our families safe and healthy. And everybody enjoy the rest of the week. Once again, miigwech, and have a great weekend.